and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie. All in the weeks ahead on C-SPAN's Book Notes. Leaders of NATO member countries are meeting later this month. Now, a discussion of how NATO has changed in recent years and how the alliance has accepted new members. Georgetown University hosted this event. It's just over an hour.
I'm the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and we're co-sponsoring this talk today with the Center for German and European Studies, whose director Jeffrey Anderson is here, and former director Professor Sam Barnes is here, so we're delighted to be co-sponsoring this. And I'm delighted to be introducing Ron Asmus to you. Dr. Asmus started his career as an analyst for Radio Free Europe in the GDR, and he was one of the few people. He spent time there. He had a very solid understanding of the politics, the culture, the history of the GDR, and he wrote some really quite path-breaking reports, research reports for RFE when he was working in the GDR. He then did a PhD at Johns Hopkins University at CERES, on whose board I sat, and his PhD also dealt with politics in the GDR. Thereafter, he joined the RAND Corporation, where he began to work on a variety of issues connected to security. And in 1997, he was hired to work in the State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, and he was really very instrumental in the enlargement of NATO. That was really his major task, and it's about that he's written his book that's hot off the presses, a copy of which you see here. Alas, you can't take it with you, but it will be in your stores soon. Is it already there? Anyway, very soon. After he left the State Department in the year 2000, he became a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is still an adjunct senior fellow there now, but he's now the program director for the Atlantic Partnership Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, where again he's dealing with many of the European security and related issues that he dealt with both at RAND and in the State Department. So we are delighted to have you here. He's making a lot of appearances in the next few weeks around town, so we're delighted to have him here. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Angela. For those of you who have written PhDs, as well as for those of you who might write PhDs, you know or will soon discover that you always have a warm spot in your heart for those people who sat on your dissertation board and passed you. So I've known Angela for over 20 years, and it's a pleasure to be here and to have Angela introduce me, as well as Jeff, who's an old friend as well. I'd like to talk a little bit today about NATO enlargement, largely talking about my book, but also applying the lessons of the book to what we face today in the run-up to the Prague summit in several weeks. And I'd like to start out, though, with a word about the book, because I think you have to know a little bit about me and what kind of book this is to understand what I'm going to try to talk about today. When people ask me, what is your book really about, I always say it's a diplomatic, intellectual, and political history of the whole NATO enlargement debate of the 1990s. And when I came out of the State Department, you had one of those rare moments in life where, in this case, Secretary Albright said, "How can I say thank you?" And these are moments that you should think carefully about, because they don't come very often in life. And I said to Secretary Albright, we had all read, and many of you who are studying European studies have read the book by Condi Rice and Phil Zelikow on German unification, and I said I thought that the whole NATO enlargement debate had been one of those historical turning points, and that the story about the debate and the diplomacy, but also the fights, the political intellectual battles over policy, deserved to be told, and deserved to be told now and not in 30 years when the archives were open. And so Secretary Albright agreed to give me access, and I was very fortunate to have access to the still classified archives of the State Department in order to write this book. So in some ways, the Zelikow-Rice book was kind of a model for me in terms of the story I wanted to tell. But I was also determined to try to bring this story to life, to bring the people, the personalities, the issues, the fights, the passion, the drama, if you will, to life, so that when it is assigned for your course next year, you're not bored reading it, but find it lively and understand truly what it's like to be a policymaker faced with these issues. Because I found that, I think as all of us have gone through our academic intellectual training, and then you actually end up in a job like I had, or Angela had in the State Department, you find the world's a lot different than sometimes you imagine to be if you had just read some of the literature that we all read in our courses and assign to our classes. I mean, I was fortunate in the sense that I was at RAND in the early 90s when this whole debate started, when communism collapsed, and when we faced the question of what should NATO become? What was it supposed to do? Should the U.S. stay in Europe or should the U.S. withdraw? And I was part of that team of people that first proposed NATO enlargement. And then, having written all these big ideas in articles, I was fortunate enough to be asked to serve my country, to go in and actually try to implement some of those things I'd written about sort of in a theoretical sense 5 years earlier. And I tried to integrate all of this to give you the best account that I was capable of providing on why we enlarged NATO, how it happened, what the challenges were, and to bring to life some of the people, the personalities, and the story, at least as I witnessed it. I often say about my book that it's about the first phase of NATO modernization after the Cold War, and that today we're in the second phase. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what I mean by that is the Cold War ends, we declare victory, but we face the question, which theoretically many people had written about before: what was supposed to happen to NATO? What kind of Europe did we want? What kind of transatlantic relationship do we want? And how did NATO fit in? And in many ways, the Bush administration, Bush Sr. now, did a masterful job in bringing the Cold War to an end, in unifying Germany, but it didn't answer this question. And Bill Clinton comes in as a newly elected president from Arkansas, elected on a domestic reform agenda, not having thought necessarily in great detail about questions like NATO or European security, U.S.-European relations, and he is handed this issue very early on in his administration. And you know, when people ask me, well, why did Bill Clinton, who came in on the platform that he ran on, end up embracing NATO enlargement and making it one of his top foreign policy priorities over the next 8 years? And my answer is always twofold, because as Bill Clinton engaged in this issue, there's one thing he kept on saying to his staff and to his visitors, was that we had a unique historical opportunity to lock in peace and security in Europe once and for all. And he kept on talking about how the United States would use the power it had at the end of the Cold War to use this opportunity. He had a vision of Europe whole and free. It was a vision that included Central and Eastern Europe, and frankly also included Russia. And he wanted to use this window of opportunity and this influence that the United States had to lock that in, to as we often said, to make the prospect of conflict, of war in the eastern half of Europe as remote or almost inconceivable as it had become in the western half of Europe over the previous 50 years. And when Bill Clinton decided to enlarge NATO, he didn't do it as an anti-Russian move. He didn't do it because he believed the big bad Russians were in danger of threatening, let alone attacking Central and Eastern Europe. He did it as an act, as a policy of integration, an attempt to project and expand stability to the eastern half of Europe. And he believed all along that you could do that without creating a new crisis in relations with Russia, and that he could manage the relationship with Moscow as well as his personal relationship with Boris Yeltsin in a way that will allow us to square the circle. The second reason Bill Clinton decided to enlarge NATO was because his vision wasn't just about making Europe whole and free, peaceful, stable, and secure. It was also about modernizing the transatlantic relationship for the future. And one thing that was interesting when I had the opportunity to go back and go through the files, you find Bill Clinton always asking his staffers, his aides, well, what do we tell the American people? What do we tell them NATO's for? What is NATO going to do that's modern, that's forward-looking, that's not about the past, but about the future? And how do I explain and how do I change NATO and make it relevant to the problems not of the Cold War, but the problems of the post-Cold War era? And in his mind, the relationship or alliance with Europe wasn't just a temporary phenomenon. It was a permanent alliance that he wanted to carry on into the future. And he felt that as we looked out into this new globalizing world, if the U.S. and Europe could be together, could have a common framework, a common alliance, we both would be much better off. And that he was trying to push NATO in that direction from the very beginning. And I think that's important as we, perhaps in the question and answer, talk about some of the problems and tensions we have in the current relationship. And I'll tell you one story I recall in my book is a senator, in this case it was Ted Stevens, who was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, senator from Alaska, a very powerful individual, came in to see the president along with several other senators, and you'll find the exact story in the book, but Senator Stevens essentially says, I'm against this. What do we do in expanding our role in Europe at a time when Europe is one of the most peaceful parts of the globe? We should be pulling out of Europe. China, that's the problem. I don't want to spend a dime on Europe. I want to pull out of Europe, not expand our influence in Europe. I don't understand, Mr. President, why you're doing this. And the president says in response, Senator, I agree with you that maybe China down the road might be a bigger strategic problem we should face. But what I'm trying to do is lock in peace and security in Europe once and for all. So if and when we have to face those challenges, we can do so not having to worry about Europe, too, becoming unstable. And if we succeed in stabilizing Europe, maybe then the European allies will start thinking about problems beyond their borders, and maybe they'll even start to become allies and partners who are willing to work with us on some of these broader problems. And I want to have a system that keeps the peace in Europe and that transforms this alliance so that we can look at the new problems of the future. Now, I'm not convinced he convinced Ted Stevens that day, but I thought it was a really good example of what it was he was trying to create and what the team that worked for him were trying to implement. I want to briefly take you through what I think were the 5 biggest challenges of the whole NATO enlargement debate of the last decade, and do so with an eye toward how many of those challenges remain and are apt or critical today as we look out in the future. And the first challenge, of course, was convincing ourselves, the Americans, the United States and government, that we should do this. In my book, I describe how in 10 years ago, we're now in 2002, in 1992, when people first started thinking about NATO enlargement, it was heresy. I think it's fair to say that the vast, vast majority of the political and strategic community in Western Europe and the United States opposed it. Indeed, when I first started articulating some of these early ideas, it was a very lonely intellectual battle, and you'll find some of the stories about just how lonely it is. And I recall one in the book which with a colleague of mine at RAND, we had gone in to brief the senior director in the White House and the National Security Council in charge of Europe, and we had our briefing on why NATO enlargement was good and how you do it, and she looked at us and says, you guys, no one in this government agrees with you. Everyone thinks this is a stupid idea, with 2 exceptions. And we asked, well, who are they? And she said, Bill Clinton and Tony Lake. And at that point, I nudged my colleague and I said, he started to argue. I said, no, let's go home and declare victory and have a drink. And I mention that because it really was, the overwhelming consensus was against it. And I try to describe in my book the battles that took place initially within the administration and then outside of the administration until the U.S. government reached the decision that we wanted to do this. And that process took roughly the first 2 years of the Clinton administration. And the reasons people were opposed to it were the fact that, or the danger that it could alienate Russia, and the argument that Russia was more important, and it was the big prize we had to keep our eye on, and you couldn't do both. The second argument against it was going to dilute NATO. It was going to destroy NATO, to enlarge it to these unstable democracies in Central and Eastern Europe whose capabilities were unknown, whose institutions were untested. And the third argument was really the doubts we had about, was Central Europe really like us? Was it really part of the West? Was it mature enough? And I often talk about the sort of 2 faces of Central and Eastern Europe. Solidarity, freedom, fighting dissidents, fighting for the same values that NATO was supposed to represent. And I remember the first time I went to Poland after this and saw people saying, well, we're just as democratic as you are. We actually fought for our freedom. Why can't we join your alliance? That's what we fought for. So that was the one image of Central and Eastern Europe. The other image was the nationalist xenophobic, at times anti-Semitic past of Central and Eastern Europe. So which Central Europe were we inviting to join our alliance was a big issue in the early 90s. And we had to devise a system so that we could convince ourselves, and they could convince ourselves, that it was going to be the right kind of Central Europe, that these countries were becoming like us in terms of values, in terms of capability, so that we feel comfortable extending that Article 5 commitment. The first challenge was dealing with the Americans, the second challenge was dealing with the Europeans. And there were two parts of that, the West Europeans and the Central and East Europeans. And the challenge for the West Europeans was that they were not convinced that the U.S. was serious. They were not convinced we could pull this off without a train wreck with Russia. And they weren't convinced it was the right strategy. And even though there were individuals like the then German Defense Minister Volker Ruhr, who was actually the first senior European politician to call for NATO enlargement, the reality of support was quite weak. You'll find in my book a rather dramatic story when Dick Holbrooke goes to Bonn as the U.S. ambassador to Germany. In his first cable back to Washington, he says, "I met with 3 senior Germans today, starting with Chancellor Kohl, and every one of them told me to ignore Volker Ruhr and that that's not German policy and that they're against NATO enlargement." And this right at the time when the U.S. was moving to making a decision to enlarge NATO. The French, there's this wonderful quote from a senior French official who said, "Enlarging NATO is like giving it vitamins. It's revitalizing at a time when France wants it to go away, wants it to become less important, not more important." The British were profoundly unsure whether this was a good idea or we could do it. So the U.S. government spent those years in the mid-90s trying to answer all the questions, eliminate the doubts, convince people that we could do this and we could do it right, which meant that we could do it without destroying NATO, without diluting the alliance, and without the train wreck with Russia. So the problem with the West Europeans was to move slowly, carefully, answer their questions, build the consensus so that we'd have the support in the alliance to do it. In a sense, the challenge with the Central and East Europeans was the opposite. They wanted to come in now. They wanted to come in instantly. To some degree, they felt they were entitled to it. They would often say to us, "We toppled communism. We suffered for 40 years. You should bring us in yesterday." And I tell, like Valenza had this favorite story he used to tell many people, including the President of the United States, but I recall the story when our ambassador to Warsaw, Nick Ray, arrives in December '94, Polish-American businessman from New York. He goes to see Valenza the day of his arrival, and Valenza throws all the advisors out of the room, takes Nick in the corner, sits him down, nose to nose, and says, "I want to talk about Russia." Says, "You Americans are naive. You don't understand Russia like we do. We've lived with it for all these centuries. You Americans think you can tame the bear, but before you tame the bear, you need to cage it." And those were the kind of dialogues and conversations that were taking place. And I think Nick Ray actually responded and say, "Isn't it kind of dangerous to try to cage the bear, Mr. President?" But, Central Europe felt it had a window of opportunity that was in danger of being frittered away, and that if we didn't act now, the West would lose its nerve and they might never get in. And President Valenza in public often said, it's like 1936, 1938. You've got to do it. You've got to do it now. And we had to convince the Central East Europeans that moving slowly, by trying to work with Russia, it was a better way of doing this, and they would get in, and they would get in without precipitating a crisis with Russia. And they weren't sure. And it's only gradually over time that we managed to convince them that they're not ready to join, that they have to do a lot of homework themselves, and the problem isn't us or only us, it's what they need to do too. But this culminates in, and I describe this in the book, there's one week in the fall of 1996 where Helmut Kohl comes at the first half of the week and says to the president, "Slow, don't move fast. Don't listen to those Republicans urging you to move faster. You've got to do this slow and deliberate, and we have to be very careful." Havel comes in 2 days later and says, "You got to move. You've dilly-dallied around for 2 years. We're losing hope. People are pessimistic. You've got to show the world and us that you're going to do this." And the president assures him that he is committed. He's going to go forward with this. The third challenge, of course, was Russia, and how to convince Russia that NATO enlargement wasn't aimed against it, wouldn't profoundly affect or harm its national security interests, and that Russia was better off not fighting us tooth and nail to stop us, but negotiating its own separate agreement with NATO so that it could defend its interests by working and cooperating with us as opposed to fighting us. And that in some ways is the most dramatic parts of this story that often boil down to some very interesting and high-stake conversations between President Clinton and Boris Yeltsin, because I'm convinced, and I think the documents show, that Boris Yeltsin starts out kind of open-minded about NATO enlargement. There are two conversations, one, a famous one he has with Lech Walesa, where he de facto agrees to that it's Poland's choice to join NATO and Russia shouldn't oppose it. He goes home, gets clobbered in the press, and retracts that. But a year later, in September '94, Bill Clinton has his first conversation with Boris Yeltsin, and those of you in government can imagine it. It's over coffee at the end of a long meal where you always save the toughest issues to be raised. And the president says to Yeltsin, well, look, Boris, I'm going to do this. I'm going to enlarge NATO. I want you to know it's not aimed against you. I'm not one of these guys that wakes up thinking anti-Russian thoughts every morning. I'm doing this to unify Europe, and a unified Europe is in your interest too. And Yeltsin says, okay, let's talk about how we're going to address this in the press conference. And we come away thinking, maybe we have a pale green light. Maybe this won't be as impossible as everyone says it is. But what happens is Yeltsin goes back, and again, the nationalist and critical forces in the Russian political can drive him increasingly to oppose us. And the initial understanding that Yeltsin thinks he has fritters away as Yeltsin's driven into more and more opposition, and as the Russian government starts talking openly and less openly about threats, about the consequences of NATO enlargement. And there's a long period of very tough negotiations until, at the end of the day, the United States makes it crystal clear, and you'll see the moment of truth, what I call it in my book, is when Primakov finally realizes, or the United States side, in this case, Deputy Secretary of State Talbot, who's conducting these negotiations, Primakov finally realized he's not going to stop us. And because he was pursuing a clear policy of, and he admitted it quite openly, on the one hand, negotiating with us to see the best deal he could get, while on the other hand, trying to undercut us and stop us by playing divide and conquer, by trying to scare the West Europeans from doing this, and to see which track would lead to a better result from a Russian perspective. And it's only when the United States makes it absolutely crystal clear we're going to do this with or without a NATO-Russia deal that suddenly the Russians start to negotiate seriously, and this leads to a very helter-skelter set of negotiations where we're trying to put together what becomes the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which is negotiated between Secretary Albright and Primakov and NATO Secretary General Javier Solana. The fourth challenge, and if there are any of you here from Central Europe, you'll know this one, was who should get in and who shouldn't, and would the door remain open for further rounds? Now we're sitting here 3 weeks before Prague talking about a big round of 7 countries. If you had suggested 5 years ago that 7 countries might join NATO, now people would have declared you nuts. And if you go back to the origins, it's quite clear that many people thought NATO enlargement would and should be a one-time deal. 1, 2, 3 countries, many of our allies were saying to us. And it took a huge effort by the administration to say, no, the door had to remain open. And not only that the door had to remain open, but who would set the standards? And how would we decide which countries came in and which countries didn't? Because we, the United States, said to those countries that were unlikely to come in, we will make sure that your security is not harmed by bringing in the other countries. And I know, because when I came in, this was one of the first jobs I was handed by Albright and Talbot. They would often say to me, the job of dealing with the countries who are not getting in is as hard and sometimes harder than the job of dealing with the countries who want to bring in. But that policy, so controversial at the time, I believe today created a great deal of stability and laid the foundation for the new round of enlargement that we're going to have at Prague. But it's the irony of ironies that what is the issue over which the Allies have the biggest political food fight, the greatest divisions? It's not Russia. We managed the Russia angle okay at the end and do fine. When we get to the Madrid summit, the issue that keeps foreign ministers locked in a room for hours on end trying to negotiate a deal is the question of who gets in and who doesn't. and would the door stay open to future members? And I describe a lot of those intense battles and arguments between heads of state and how we managed that at Madrid in my book. The final challenge was ratification, was taking this package of invitations and open-door commitment, a NATO-Russia agreement, and getting it through the U.S. Senate. And again, it's one of those issues where, in retrospect, we look back and say, well, it was an 80-19 vote. There was all this debate. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that NATO enlargement was probably or one of the most controversial foreign policy issues of the 1990s. But what was that all about? Because you got an 80-20 vote, 80-19 vote in the Senate, was a pretty decisive victory. The vote was deceiving. And, you know, I quote President Clinton in my book, who a week after the vote says to Italian Prime Minister Prodi, it was deceiving. It was a lot harder fought, closer, and messier behind the scenes, because this was not only a vote about these three countries. It was a vote about what kind of NATO we wanted, what kind of Europe we wanted, and senators understood that they were voting for a process that ultimately down the road would bring in other countries. And you'll see that if you have a chance to read my book, that within the administration, people thought this could be another League of Nations. This could be another situation where if we were to lose the vote, and we thought it was quite possible that we might lose the vote, it could have far-reaching, indeed catastrophic implications for the future of U.S.-European relations down the road, which is exactly why the administration made such a big effort to try to knit together this coalition of Democrats and Republicans who frankly then and now don't like each other, and senators who frankly didn't talk to each other very much, but nonetheless managed to find ways to come together to support NATO enlargement. So those were the 5 challenges of the last round. Where are we today? And what are the issues as we head toward Prague? I think there's a very interesting and important parallel between the early 90s and where we are today, because it comes back to that question of purpose and what do we want NATO to be for in the new world in which we live. Because the question Bill Clinton had to answer was, what is NATO's role in a world absent the Soviet Union and communism? His answer was to fix Europe, to help Europe become whole and free and secure, and to lock that in once and for all, so that we never again have to worry about fighting a major war in Europe. And then the second term, he started to address the second question of what about those new and other threats that may come from beyond Europe? And as we headed into the Washington summit in '99, the debate we were having was, should NATO just remain focused on Europe, or should NATO start to think about some of the problems beyond Europe? And I was with Secretary Albright in '98, '99, where the first time we went to NATO and said, well, what about Saddam Hussein and weapons of mass destruction? And we didn't have any agreement. Indeed, we had no meeting of the minds, because the European view was that NATO had plenty to do in Europe. We hadn't completed the job of making Europe whole and free. And these other threats, well, maybe they existed, they were too abstract, too distant. And I remember and recall in the book how one of my colleagues said to me, well, Ron, it's not so much that we disagree with this new vision, but you're too early. Why don't you come back in a decade after we've finished the job in Europe, reaching out to Russia, and then maybe we'll have the political energy and capital to think about Iraq, the greater Middle East, and those issues. And I remember that conversation on September 11th, because I think all of us who were part of that team woke up after September 11th and said, oh my God, that world, the world in which we feared might come, has arrived sooner, faster, and messier and uglier than we ever thought it would. And what are we going to do now? What is the future of the alliance? And I think it's interesting, as different as President Bush and President Clinton are, and they are indeed very different, this president, too, has continued that policy of NATO enlargement and taking it to the next step. We are going to have another, indeed a bigger round of NATO enlargement in Prague, probably 7 countries. On NATO, Russia, despite conservative criticism of the founding act and accusations that we had mishandled that piece, they are pursuing, in essence, the same policy and, again, taking it the next step. But the big question which this administration hasn't yet fully answered yet, and which I think will be on the table at Prague, is what does it want NATO to do in a world where that vision of Europe whole and free is now, especially if we do a so-called Big Bang round of enlargement in Prague and Copenhagen, it's within our grasp. You know, I often say if Harry Truman would look down upon us from the heavens, he would say, not bad, pretty good job. All of Central and Eastern Europe stabilized, integrated into the West in 10 years. You guys maybe could have moved a little faster, but you got it done. I think it will go down in history as a great accomplishment. But the very success in securing peace in Europe, coupled with our growing understanding and realization of these new threats from beyond Europe, posed the question of, when is NATO's job done? Is it done when Europe is peaceful, secure, and stable? Or is the next logical step for us to try to adapt that framework to deal with these new threats, which threaten Europe as much as the United States, which are potentially existential because they involve weapons of mass destruction? And frankly, if you ask me, Saddam Hussein is far more evil and more dangerous than Slobodan Milosevic ever was, and I was part of the team who believed we had to go to war to stop Slobodan Milosevic. So these are the kinds of questions we now have to grapple with. And I just want to conclude with the same way I conclude in the book, is to go back to Harry Truman and his speech at the founding of NATO on April 4, 1949, here in Washington, D.C. And there's a funny story is when we were dealing with, I was probably unusual, like Angela, for State Department people, in that we had PhDs and we're historians and scholars who were interested in all this stuff. So during this big debate about what NATO was for, we asked the historians to go into the archives and to find what Truman and Atchis and all these people had written and said and public, and how they had thought about NATO's purpose. And they brought to me several interviews and speeches, including Harry Truman's speech, opening speech, founding of NATO. And it's a remarkable speech. You could change about a couple paragraphs and give it today, because he doesn't even talk about Stalin or the Soviet Union or communism. He talks about NATO as an act of self-defense by democracies bound together by a common civilization and democratic heritage. And he talks about NATO as an alliance to deal with whatever threats threaten those countries and that heritage as democratic states. And I think the philosophy of that speech is still very apt today, and it goes to the question of, do we now adapt this greatest alliance of the 20th century to deal with the threats of the 21st century, or do we leave it focused on Europe, and it becomes the manager of peace in increasingly stable Europe? But the paradox we face is that we have this great alliance dealing with a set of threats that is diminishing. Thank God, I say, because we're succeeding. We have no alliance to deal with the greatest threats to our common security. And that's what I think is the issue on the table, and that's what I think, as we move toward Prague, will increasingly become the focal point of what I'd call the second phase of the NATO relevance and modernization debate. Thank you very much. Sure?
Your own questions?
Sure.
Okay. Questions? Comments?
Now, you got to ask me tough questions. Once I set up a speech for Secretary Albright at a university, and Albright had been a professor, was a professor, is a professor here, and I said, oh, she'll love this audience. This is her in her element. And we got there, she looked at me and said, whose idea was this? And I said, Madam Secretary, it was my idea. She goes, don't you know that students always ask the toughest questions? So, I said, yeah, I know, but you can handle it. Yes?
What do you think of this notion that for many Europeans, the idea of enlarging NATO is sort of a consolation prize for countries that are not going to make it into the EU?
I think if we could go back in time, which is hard to do, if we had gone back to 1992, most people thought the EU was the institution that would take the lead in the integration of the new democracies into the West. It was incapable of doing that. It stumbled. And actually, if you go back and ask the Central Europeans in 1990, what institution did they first want to reach out to them, it wasn't NATO. It was the EU, or in the case of some of them, Jerzy Dienstbier, and even Havel in his early phase was the OSCE. But they gave up very quickly on the EU as it just simply was proved unable to step up the plate and handle that. And they turned to NATO because they wanted us and because they wanted the anchor. And there was only one anchor in the early 90s. The EU wasn't a realistic anchor for these countries. NATO was, and they all turned to us. And we initially, I think it's fair to say, even in the Clinton administration, initially thought we would have been perfectly happy if the EU had been able to take the lead in integrating these countries. And some of the more dramatic memos you'll find in my book is where people say the EU can't do it. It's us or no one. we have to do it. We have to take the lead, and that was key in our decision. And we felt and made the decision and adopted a strategy where if we went first, if we extended that security umbrella and kind of took the security issues off the table, that would make it easier for the EU to enlarge, and that EU enlargement would follow NATO enlargement, but not go first. And the big debate was, if you talk to senators, they say, aren't you letting the EU off the hook? Or the way you put it, isn't NATO the kind of consolation prize? But I think answering that security issue was very important in terms of taking off the table and allowing the much more complicated process of EU integration to unfold. And I don't believe that the EU would ever have enlarged had NATO not enlarged first. Today it's a little bit different. Today the EU is a second magnet, a second anchor, in a way it wasn't 10 years ago, to be quite honest. So today these countries can talk and look at both of them, and they've decided to join NATO too, but it's not as dramatic as it was in the 90s. And I think it's particularly true in the case of the Baltic states, where this issue was the most acute, because I was one of the responsibilities I had was for Nordic-Baltic relations, and I was the U.S. negotiator for the U.S. Baltic Charter. And as we did a lot of consultations, it became clear to me that the EU was not going to put the Baltic states on the list to get an invitation to the EU if it had to take over the responsibility of managing Baltic-Russian relations. And that we had to send a strategic signal as the United States that we were going to manage that. We were going to help the Balts and the Europeans deal with that question. And when we did that, it helped the EU deal with the Baltic issue.
So we're talking about the purpose of NATO for the future, and that's obviously a key issue in terms of relevance. And you mentioned that maybe Iraq would be one possible or out-of-area operation, but also there's been a lot of talk about terrorism and the use of NATO as an instrument in the war on terrorism. How do you see that? Would that be a suitable purpose for NATO?
I would define NATO's purpose in fairly simple terms. I would say that if you think of the Euro-Atlantic community as North America, the US and Canada, and this new Europe, NATO should deal with the most direct threats to the countries of that community. And those threats, in my mind, are terrorism. I consider Iraq part of the terrorism problem personally. But above all, it's the nexus of weapons of mass destruction and rogue states and terrorism. And if you ask yourself the pretty brutal but very important question, what is the greatest likelihood, or where is the greatest likelihood of large numbers of Europeans and Americans being killed? And what are those threats? Is it Russia? A land invasion by Russia? No. Is it ethnic conflict in the Balkans? Well, we may still see ethnic conflict in the Balkans, but that's not, if we're honest, an existential threat to Europe as a whole or the United States. The greatest danger we face of large numbers of our citizens being killed come from outside of this community. And in a world where a terrorist threat can be planned in Hamburg, financed in Asia, and carried out in New York, Washington, Pennsylvania, and possibly Rome, London, and Paris the next time, we need to rethink, which is why NATO is now taking the official step of saying we will go wherever we need to go to address those threats. We don't have the capability to do that, but politically we've said we have to be prepared to do that. And if this alliance can't address the biggest threats to our citizens, it's not doing its job. And I think that that whole bundle of issues of new threats is what we have to confront. There may be other ones that we haven't yet experienced or even seen coming down the road. And when my philosophy and the philosophy of NATO at the Washington summit in 1999, which was the 50th anniversary summit, the heads of state issued a statement which had one sentence which I think was the most important one, where they said, we need to be as good at dealing with the threats of the next 50 years as NATO was in dealing with the threats of the last 50 years. And I think that's the philosophy we need to have. And when the threats change, we can't simply say, well, NATO only goes this far, and if there's a threat 25 kilometers further, if that threat can affect our citizens, our countries, and our democratic civilization and heritage, we have to be able to address it.
Given the current debate over the transatlantic tensions and the potential transatlantic divorce between Europe and the U.S. Over the Iraq the ICC, Kyoto Protocol, steel tariffs, and name any number more. How, if at all, do you think this will affect NATO's future relevancy and capabilities?
Well, I have a very simplistic view of the world, which is there's the set of problems we have in the U.S.-European relation, which are the results of our success, and those which are the results of our failure. And some of the issues you mentioned I put in the first category. I often say if Harry Truman, my mythical Harry Truman, came back and sat in the seminar today and you told him the biggest issues in the transatlantic relationship and that NATO is in danger of being derailed by Kyoto, GMOs, death penalty, he'd look at you and say, you guys are nuts. He didn't have the luxury, nor did he even try to integrate our views and policies on issues like that. He was worried about war and peace. He was worried about survival. And they didn't even think or try about coordinating and having common views on this. The fact that we talk about this today is a good thing, but it's a result that our societies have become so bloody integrated and close that these things are very emotional and relevant political issues. But that's a result of the huge success we've had in integrating and sort of creating a common Euro-Atlantic civilization where we think we have a right to say what you're doing on those issues is wrong and needs to be changed, otherwise we can get along. So I don't think those are as important as they are. I differentiate between those questions and our ability to coordinate on questions of war and peace and fundamental strategic issues. And there I think we do have problems, because I don't need to tell you that we're looking at Iraq and a lot of these other issues differently. But there, too, I think it's a question, first and foremost, of leadership. I mean, I've been through some pretty nasty NATO brawls in my still very brief diplomatic career. The difference today, in my mind, is not that we're so much more powerful, because we were more powerful vis-a-vis Europe in the 50s than we are today, or at least as powerful. It's not that, you know, we have fights. We fought all the time. The difference is Truman and his generation believed that we had to do this together. And when Harry Truman founded NATO, we didn't have a common strategy on this vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. He ordered his guys, and there were no gals at the time, in diplomacy. They ordered their guys in the room and said, you guys come up with a common strategy. And don't come out of that room until and we've negotiated and fought and argued for 50 years, but ultimately we came up with a strategy, and it worked. And we don't have the same commitment today on either side of the Atlantic, because we haven't yet been brought together either by leadership or a sense of a common threat. And I think, you know, I'm truly convinced that if Truman and his generation or people of that caliber and philosophy are around, they would be saying, hey guys, get your act together here. You have to do this together. And the question is, how close to the abyss do we have to walk before we realize we're really in this together? So I think it's still possible to put that together. But I do think that history is cruel sometimes. And if we miss this opportunity, we can get it wrong. We don't always get it right, and sometimes we haven't. And I think Prague is important because, and I'm a Democrat, I'm not a fan of the president, but I think we should wait and see what he says, because you know, it took Bill Clinton 2 years to figure out what he wanted to do. And I don't think this president came to office with a clear view of what he wanted from relations with Europe, from this alliance. But there's something about a summit that focuses the mind. Indeed, I saw that Lord Robertson, in a speech on NATO's future, said there's something about the gallows that focuses the mind. And I think for the first time, this administration is really focused on answering this question, because all the critics are posing the same questions I'm posing to you today. What do you want this alliance to do? What do you want it to become? And I think he and his team they know they made some mistakes. They know they mismanaged U.S.-European relations. They know they need to come up with an answer to this question. They say they're going to try to answer it at Prague. I'm a show me the color of your money guy, so I want to see what they have to say. But I think they're now, for the first time, seriously grappling with these questions in a way they weren't 12 months ago. There's someone over here, yes?
I've got a question about the proposed rapid reaction force.
Right.
I guess two questions. One, do you think that it's the appropriate vehicle to respond to Article 24 non-traditional security threats? And two, what is it going to take to get it off the ground in terms of time and contributions to make it an actual legitimate response?
I think you have to view the NATO Rapid Reaction Force against the backdrop of DCI and what DCI was intended to do, the lessons we've done. When we did the Defense Capabilities Initiative in '99, it was part of this debate about what NATO should do. And we are essentially trying to create a set of programs that give NATO the capability to intervene in and around Europe, to do peacekeeping, to do the Kosovos of the future, and to do, and I hate to use these, sort of real war fighting, but not high-end war fighting. But it was, no one was talking about NATO doing expeditionary warfare, going beyond Europe and the capability to lift and deploy and sustain itself over distance. September 11th, and we don't do a very good job then of implementing DCI. So we realized that that's not working, plus we have September 11th. So what the Bush administration did is says, look, let's scale back all these goals and focus on a couple key things. And the reality is maybe in this new world we don't need big packages of forces. We need Ranger-like forces to do things like the 10th Mountain Division did in Afghanistan, to be able to go to places and fight. But we don't need 5 or 6 divisions, we need 1 or 2 divisions. Because the kinds of wars and conflicts we're going to face are going to be very different. So let's tell the Europeans to set aside or drop a lot of those targets we set a couple years ago and focus. And the single most important thing they could do would be to create a limited capacity to deploy with forces in the next Afghanistan, in Africa, in places beyond Europe, but sort of contiguous to Europe, and to be able to fight with American forces. And the NATO response force is designed to give Europe that capability to be able to deploy up to 25,000 people, sustain themselves in the field for a month in a pretty demanding environment. And we've essentially said, let's let the other stuff slip or abolish it. And let's focus on this, because this is the single most important thing we want Europe to be able to do with us. Will it work? I think this will be one of the real test cases. I think that people now look back at Afghanistan and wish they would have given NATO a more proactive role. I think the NATO response force is designed to be able to participate in a future Afghanistan-like conflict. I think it could play a role, certainly in a peacekeeping role, in a post-intervention Iraq scenario, or maybe if there's another scenario like that down the road. But what we've realized is the future is not the big wars we used to plan for. The future, if there are going to be conflicts, are going to be much, much smaller, require better trained, better equipped, but much smaller numbers of forces. So if you can take your money and focus it on purchasing this capability, that's enough. So Europe, our message to Europe is you don't need to spend $370 billion like we do. You need to focus your money, spend a bit more, and have a modest capability to partner with us to be able to conduct some of these missions together. But again, it's going to require not only money, but the transformation of European thinking. Because Europe, for good reasons, got out of the tradition of expeditionary warfare in most of the last century, and now we're saying, well, we want you to have that capability. And the classic example, of course, is the German Bundeswehr, which we created so that it couldn't go anywhere and fight, but in the center front in Germany. And now you have the paradox that Romanian troops are more mobile, and the Romanians can lift a battalion and deploy to Afghanistan without having to ask anyone for any help. And the German Bundeswehr has to take a train to Odessa and then rent a Ukrainian airplane and fly and this, that, and the other thing, because they plan for something completely different. So it's also that transformation, which is very hard psychologically and politically in these countries. But my view is, I don't know, I was with a group of senators at a dinner the other night, and one of the senators, who has been very skeptical about NATO taking on all these new missions, at the end he said, you can go to the dance, and if the first time someone comes by and asks you, you turn them down, that's one thing. But if you say no the second time, they're going to stop coming and ask you. And that's where NATO is headed now with Iraq and the next crisis. If NATO doesn't have a role in these new threats and new crises, people are going to legitimately ask the question, why? What is it for? What is it doing? Why are we spending this money?
Keeping the NATO door open for further enlargement, and beyond the 2 other candidate countries which are not going to make it for this time, and Albania and Macedonia, do you think that NATO should include in the future countries like Ukraine and Georgia? And if yes, what should be the new deal with Russia?
answer is I don't know. I think that the debate over the last decade was really about unifying and integrating a vision of Europe that was from the Baltic to the Black Sea. So I think if Sweden, Finland, Austria, on the one hand, or even Croatia, Albania, and Macedonia managed to get to the point where they qualify, I think bringing them into NATO is not going to be hugely controversial. We'll wait and see. I think that's part of the same concept and vision we have. But even when I was in the State Department, I used to say to my staff, there's the 10-year plan, the 25-year plan, and the 50-year plan, and you're doing the 10-year plan, because that's what we were in charge of. And the 10-year plan was Baltic to the Black Sea. It was to integrate and to consolidate security and peace and democracy in Central and Eastern Europe. And Ukraine and Russia were different projects on a different timeline. Now, when Secretary Albright had to answer this question in testimony, what do you think about Russia joining NATO? Because, our policy was to keep the door open, which we all believed in. She would answer, if we ever get to the point where Russia qualifies, where Russia's starting to become like Poland or something like that, and we get to the point where Russia truly wants to be our ally, doesn't want to join NATO to screw it up, but wants to join NATO to strengthen and be an ally, well, then it's a different Russia, different Europe, and we'd have to rethink NATO yet again, but those would be the problems of success. And those would be the problems of us having succeeded beyond our wildest dreams in transforming these parts of the Eurasian continent, and I'd welcome those problems, because, we'd have to rethink again. But I think what's interesting is that this big round of NATO enlargement has awakened aspirations in these countries that you mentioned who didn't dare think they could join or would ever be accepted. And now the Georgians go to my little Estonian, Latvian, and say, how did you guys do this? We were in the Soviet Union together. We were about as rich as you were, and now you're in NATO and the EU, and we're where we are. What do we miss here, and how do we come up with a long-term strategy for becoming like you? And frankly, I want them to think that way. And these are questions we will have to answer, but I think it will require another debate.
I'm sorry I came late. I got stuck in the rain and in traffic jams. And I'm sure I missed a lot of what you said. But may I refer to what you said about the European Union and NATO, and that NATO would come first as the umbrella of security, and then the European Union would be possible. I think it's very difficult to put the European Union and NATO on the same level. I mean, NATO is a military alliance, which was an extremely successful alliance indeed. In fact, the only hot war we fought was in Kosovo. But the European Union is a unique experiment in sharing sovereignty. And in fact, of the three pillars of the European Union, the three pillars, it's only the economy which has been able to reach the federal level. You see, the foreign policy, security, and defense, the second pillar, is still an multinational system. And so is, of course, justice and interior, that's the third pillar. So I don't know whether one can just say, they tried to get into the EU. The EU was not able to take them in 1990, but here we are, NATO, and of course now we can do so in 2002. It's an extremely difficult process to get into the European Union because of that other substance we have in the European Union. You see, in December we have the summit in Copenhagen, as you know, which in fact is a very interesting parallel to what is happening in Prague in November. It's not exactly the same group of people, some of them are, but you see how difficult it is to get those 10 members in. They have to change their constitutions, we have to change our rules of the game in the European Union. It's very, very complicated. Besides that, we have the regional fund, the structural fund, we have to readjust, you see, and all these things. We have the Growth and Stability Pact, we have maybe to change, who knows. All these things are not what NATO is about. NATO, in fact, is a more simple, wonderful military yes and no kind of alliance, where the basic thing is not so much, it is democracy too, of course, but in the first place, it's to know who gets equipped with what. And there, of course, we have the superpower, United States, who can look into things and help a lot. So that's about this parallel I heard you make between the European Union and NATO. It's not exactly the same ball game. Another thing, I don't want to take other people's time, but you see, did you mention the European Rapid Reaction Force? You did. The 60,000 men and the 60 days and the 1 year in the field and all that. How, and that would be a question, how do you see that a sharing of burdens if this European force would ever take off the ground? We know that at the moment we have more chiefs than we have Indians, but who knows? Who knows? You know, the French are increasing their defense budget by 6% over 6 years, and you had the Minister of Defense here in Washington the other day. So the question is, will this stronger French army profit the European reform force? Will it profit itself, or will it profit NATO? Of course not NATO. It might profit France in the beauty context with the United States. We are a very good partner for the dual alliance, yes. But if it takes off the ground, would you see the European Defense Force as kind of a European police, and the Rapid Reaction Force, I don't know how the name they call it, of NATO, as kind of a fire brigade all over the world fighting whatever. Maybe that would be a solution.
It's an interesting thought. Let me come back first to your EU point, because I think what you said confirms what I was trying to say. But no, that's fine. But I'll state it again. I think, and I say this not to be critical of the EU or of anyone, but it's interesting to go back to the debate of the early 90s when we first started, or when people first started talking about NATO enlargement. Most of the European governments said, no, that's the EU's job to integrate these countries, because you and we underestimated how difficult it was to integrate them. But, I came across many a paper and cable and consultations where Germans, French, Spanish, Italians, Dutch, Danes, etc. said, why do you want to enlarge NATO? The EU is the natural lead institution to bring these countries into Europe, not NATO. And I think both sides, I think the European side recognized, and I don't mean this critically because no one knew what this meant. The collapse of communism had surprised all of us. We both ended up saying it's okay if NATO goes first. The Americans, and our debate was, well, if we go first, will that facilitate or hinder EU enlargement? And because our vision was of a big Europe, we wanted, and we're quite clear in saying we wanted the rapid most possible NATO enlargement. We decided for American policy that going first with NATO was the right thing to do and would also help encourage you to do what we thought was the right thing. I think on the EU side there was a sobering up process that was going to be much harder and take longer to bring these countries in for all the reasons you mentioned. But the other thing I want to say is I disagree a little bit with your characterization, because NATO, the U.S. and we often called NATO membership the golden carrot that we would wave in front of these countries, because the United States in particular, and Dick Holbrooke in particular, was ruthless. When Dick Holbrooke went to talk about NATO enlargement, he would go and see Prime Minister, former Defense Minister, and what was on his list? What have you done about the Holocaust lately in order to get into NATO? What have you done about your judicial reform? We used our leverage because these countries knew they needed the American support. And we didn't just look at defense reform. We didn't just look at military spending. We, in some ways before the EU even, were in there saying, internal reform, you will never get through the Senate unless you fix the following 18 things. And I think it was, and later the EU at that point, it was still, EU was so far away and too abstract for these countries that I think we played an important role in getting them to encourage them to do the right thing that they went to do this. But we called it the golden carrot, you know. And I think we both ended up reinforcing each other.
Yes. But you see,
I don't want to claim too much credit for the American side because I understand that, but I think we were, you know, and that part of my book is called Tough Love for Central and Eastern Europe, because if there was anyone who was the incorporation of tough love, it's Richard C. Holbrooke, who would browbeat these presidents and prime ministers and, you know.
He's from Hamburg. But no, the point is, you would not, I mean, entering the European Union is like, for you, changing the American Constitution, you see. It's not just changing the rules of NATO, but it's, if you have somebody entering the European Union, you have to change your substance, you see, not just the alliance. So that's just, I say this to exemplify the difference of caliber, you see.
On the Rapid Reaction Force, I just wanted to, very briefly, the debate we had about the Rapid Reaction Force in sort of 98, 99 was really a debate about what are the EU and NATO going to do. It was a little bit of competition about who does what in Europe. And we always, the American view was NATO should go first if it can, and the European Rapid Action Force should be available when NATO can't act and the EU wants to act on its own, which meant the assumption was NATO would probably do the big things, and the little crises where the United States didn't have enough of a stake involved, or thought it didn't have enough stake, would be left for the EU. The French obviously agreed with that and said, well, they should be equal, and the Rapid Action Force should be able to do whatever it wants and not have to ask the Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the interesting question is NATO does NATO Response Force, expeditionary capability. Does the EU say, well, the EU force should also be able to do expeditionary capabilities without the Americans, or does it go in the direction you suggested, where the EU says, okay, we as Europeans aren't going to go off and fight expeditionary wars without the Americans. Absolutely, you know. So those things we'll do what the Americans will do through NATO, and that the natural evolution of the European Response Force is be able to take over some missions within Europe by ourselves. And you're split on it as okay. Yes.
Just one step further on whether EU or NATO expanding first. There's one historical factor. Perhaps you're passing over a little bit the situation in 89, 90, 91, and part of the argument behind the EU enlarging is that is the question: would the United States remain in Europe? And the sense of NATO reinvigoration, redefinition, and expansion is one way of reaffirming the Atlantic commitment. Because there were views at the time in, say, 1990, 91, in some Western European countries that the EU and CSCE would become the economic and security arm, and the transatlantic connection was either expected or, in some cases, desired to be with. One could argue, and some do historically, that both the redefinition of NATO late in the Bush the elder Bush administration, and NATO expansion is a way of reaffirming and cementing transatlantic ties that otherwise might have been expected to weaken with the end of the Cold War.
I think that's largely true. I would just add the caveat, and I give the administration of Bush Sr. great credit. And it's interesting, I have a very brief chapter which I close by noting that during Bush Sr.'s last trip to Europe in the summer of '92, the issue of NATO enlargement bubbled up for the first time and only time in the ranks of the Bush administration. And they wrote a paragraph on NATO enlargement, which they debated whether George Bush had put it in his speech in Warsaw. And they were divided, and Scowcroft was against it, Baker was against it, and Cheney was for it, if I remember the lineup right. And they could have given that speech and gotten credit for starting this whole process, but they didn't, and they didn't. In part, I think it was, and I don't mean this critically, it was an administration that had reached a certain exhaustion. They had done the Gulf War, they had done German unification. They were looking at consolidating the U.S.-West European relationship and trying to figure out how to reach out to Russia and Eastern Europe, but they didn't. And indeed, most of them, and many of the members of that administration, Larry Eagleburger, Brent Scowcroft, were the most articulate opponents of NATO enlargement. later. And that's why this issue falls into Bill Clinton's lap. The Bush team walks up to the line, having accomplished what they did, and Havel has now gone to the NAC and said, why not us? And they've come pounding at the door, and the issue's starting to bubble up. And the Bush administration looks at this and says, no, we're not ready. And then they're defeated in November '92, and Bill Clinton comes in. What would have happened had Bush Sr. been reelected is an interesting case. I think a number of the members of the Bush team, Bob Zoellick in particular, who then was on the other side of the NATO enlargement debate, says we would have done exactly that had we been reelected. But it's one of those historical what-if questions. But they didn't quite. They walked up to the line on this issue, and there's the grand historical debate, which you also found in my book, on what did James Baker really mean when he said to Gorbachev, not any further. But I think the answer to that question is, this is, for those of you who don't know, it's the February 1990 conversation, the context of German unification, where the Russians later claimed that we had pledged not to enlarge NATO any further. And I think the answer is no one in that room was thinking about NATO enlargement. Not the Russians, not the Americans, and frankly, not even the Central Europeans. That all came later. That all came later.
I have a question for you.
Toughest question from my former PhD advisor.
How would you say that the first round of NATO enlargement has changed NATO? And how would you expect that the next round will change it? And I say that partly because it has not gone unnoticed that the new members of NATO and the prospective ones are thought to be, let's say, more pro-American in many ways than the older members of NATO. So that's one aspect of it. But there are other ways in which NATO obviously changes when it admits new members. So I wonder if you could say something about that.
Well, I think the great historical accomplishment of the first round was that it took Central Europe off the table geopolitically. Because the first round was really about Poland, if we're honest, in terms of strategically what we're trying to accomplish. And that's what the fight was over, and that's why the Russians hated us and tried to stop it. And by stabilizing and anchoring Poland, Central Europe was essentially on its way to being fixed. And Kwasniewski has an interesting, he comes to see Bill Clinton in the summer of '96, and he says to the president, he says, Reagan tore down the wall, Bush unified Germany, and Mr. President, your mission is to unify Europe, and it needs to start with Poland and Central Europe. And I think that's exactly what Bill Clinton thought at the time. In terms of the impact on NATO, it had no impact on decision-making, because these countries are three politically pro-Atlanticist countries that have been on very good behavior with a couple glitches, which I think is very interesting. We'll come back to Kosovo and what went wrong in Kosovo. Capabilities-wise, they've had a harder time than we thought and they thought, and that's a lesson we have to think very hard about as we bring in up to 7 new countries. And I think by and large, the positive impact of stabilizing Central Europe in that way has more than outweighed the problems we've had with capabilities. I'd do this over again, even if I knew now how hard it was going to be for those countries to reform their defense establishments, what we didn't quite understand then. I think the interesting question is when you're talking about NATO at 26 with 10 post-communist new democracy Central East European members, is how it will affect the dynamics of consensus building. And I have a slightly different way of putting it, which, because a lot of West Europeans are pro-American and they get a little bit irritated when we say the Central East European. I think, and I will admit, and other people in the administration will admit, it was our hope and assumption that the Central East Europeans could help revitalize and reinvigorate NATO, in part because we felt that societies that had had to fight more recently for their freedom maybe understood it and were willing to sacrifice a bit more because it was a more immediate experience. Second, it was always interesting to me that the Central and East Europeans didn't have, and I apologize to my West European friends, some of the same hang-ups that some West European countries had on the whole out-of-area debate. Central Europeans never had any problem with NATO going out of area in the way that some of our West European allies had deep-seated ideological, philosophical problems with. Havel, out of area, no problem. He was in favor of it in 1991, he was in favor in 1994, he was in favor in 1996, and he was better than we were at articulating the reason why NATO had to go out of area. So you had, but what we realized, and this comes back to Kosovo, that was the elite, and that the societies of Central and Eastern Europe weren't always the same as the elites were. And what happened in Kosovo, particularly I think in the Czech Republic, I mean, those people who say that, oh my God, we joined NATO and 2 weeks later we went to war, that's actually not accurate. The NATO ambassador, the 3 new members, had been sitting in the council for a year, had participated in every debate and knew everything. But Czech political leaders had not gone to their publics and said, hey, we're about to join this alliance, and we're joining this alliance for all these reasons, but there's a set of responsibilities, and there's this big debate in NATO about whether we might go to war for the first time, and we might have to do this. Because they ducked the issue for the same reason why politicians here and other places ducked the issue. And we discovered that when we went to war, the same 60% of Czechs that were in favor of NATO said, oh, we didn't know this is what it might necessarily mean. And I think, I mean, there was the famous moment in the interagency process, which Andrew remember, where we all looked at each other and said, Washington summit's going to be a Kosovo summit. And I said, oh my God, these countries are going to be with us. And they were with us. But now as we look at Iraq, I always say to my Central East European friends, remember that bad movie from 1999? You better look at it again, because, you know, between that invitation in Prague and the ratification vote in the U.S. Senate, I think the Iraq crisis will come to a head one way or the other. And Americans will naturally look and ask the question, where were you and what were you doing to help us if we had to act, if we decided we have to act. And I think that we have to have a much more open debate with the societies of Central Europe as well as with Western Europe. And my advice to Central East Europeans, we're not inviting you to join our alliance for you to be good little pupils in the corner and not saying anything. We want you to be full allies participating from day number 1 and having a voice in this debate. Because those 10 voices and 10 votes will also be an important part of the answer we give to what NATO's going to do in the future.
Is there time for one more question? If not, before we thank Ron Asmus very much, there is a reception, there is food outside, and we invite you and encourage you all to stay. And if you have any more questions, good questions or otherwise, for Ron, please ask them during the reception. We'd like to thank you very much. One of the things I forgot to say in my introduction, which I should have said, is that Ron has received a number of real honors, not only from the State Department, but Orders of Merit and Commander's Cross from Poland, from Lithuania, from Estonia. He's obviously, as he said, negotiated the U.S. Baltic Charter. So thank you very much for a very rich and informative talk, and come back again, and hope your book sells well.
You're watching Public Affairs programming on C-SPAN 2. Our schedule continues in a few moments with a forum on bioterrorism hosted by Jane's Information Group. Then we'll go live at 1 p.m. Eastern for a news conference with U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft and FBI Director Robert Mueller on drugs and terrorism.
Terry McAuliffe, chairman of the Democratic National Committee, and Mark Roscoe, chairman of the Republican National Committee, will talk about the 2002 election results today at the National Press Club in Washington. Live coverage begins at 1 p.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific, on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Wonderful. For America's classrooms, from C-SPAN and your cable company, a timeline of America's presidents. On one